So friends, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Abhishek Kaikar from the University of California, Berkeley, to this seminar series that we hold as part of the History Faculty Talks. Dr. Kaikar is an associate professor at University of Berkeley and has come up with this fascinating book on late Mughal Delhi, which deals with the idea of the popular and the politics in late Mughal Delhi. And I welcome him here, and Abhishek, most welcome, and please tell us something about your book and about this fascinating work that you've done. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll just, before I begin my presentation, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Kotial for offering me the chance to be at AUD virtually. It is one of my greatest regrets that I have not yet had the chance to visit your campus in person. I really hope that opportunity will come in the near future. I would love to spend some time in the vicinity of some of the places that loom large in the work that I've done for so many years. And so without too much further ado, with a sense, noting only a sense of wistfulness about my inability to be, potentially giving this talk next to Dara Shiko's library, let me sort of begin my talk. So my talk today is about the relation between sovereignty and popular politics in a pre-modern South Asian empire, namely the Mughal Empire, with which all of you are familiar. So I'd like to begin with a painting made in the year 1719, most likely as a gift to the Mughal Emperor Farrukhsiyar. Let's see. As you can see, this painting depicts Farrukhsiyar's procession to join in Friday prayers at the Masjid-e-Jahannama, or as we know it today, the Jama Masjid in the Mughal capital of Delhi. And I'd like to believe that from the rooftop of their campus, the spires of the masjid are visible. So there are evidently many points of interest in this painting, but I find it important because it addresses in central terms the relationship between the ruler and the ruled in the Mughal Empire. So let me begin by making a bald-faced historiographical assertion that I will be willing to defend or qualify later, to lay out the main themes of my talk today. And that is to say that when regarding paintings such as this one, historians of pre-modern South Asia have tended to focus on only one aspect of what is depicted here. So when we encounter such remaining artifacts of the Mughal court, our eyes are naturally drawn to ruling figures. Speaking in general terms, mindful of important exceptions, much of the scholarship on the empire has been historically concerned with courtly elites and their doings. And this is unsurprising. As historians, we have proven ourselves easily seduced by the razzle-dazzle of sovereignty, from the mystical claims of kingly figures identified in their halos, and the pomp and pageantry of the court and the imperial procession. So I will have more to say about sovereignty shortly. But here I want to simply remind us all that sovereignty is not and should not be treated as a given or as an object or a thing. It is rather a claim, one that is performed for an audience whose assent makes the difference between dominance and hegemony. So what is remarkable about this painting is that it is a rare instance in which the audience of sovereignty is actually depicted. Here we observe a world which rarely appears in staid courtly portraiture. In the background, we see well-dressed but distinctly humble men running up the stairs to find room in the mosque, which is evidently already full of congregants. This background was important for our painter, and it is important for us. For the small circle of imperial elites who would have handled this object, this image depicted the proper order of Mughal kingship between the ruler and the ruled, in which the latter, that is the people, served only as the background for the glory of the former. What this painting reminds us, however, is that there was, in fact, a vibrant world of men and women, even though they were not apparent in this particular image, who lived and acted in some relation to the higher structures of power in the land. There's some interference coming through. Can you hear me? I'm afraid there's some interference coming through.
There's some disturbance. Okay. I'll just remove the person. I suppose we'll figure that out.
I see. Okay, good. All right. Good. Thank you. Right. So to return to this painting, what I want to suggest today is that this painting tells us that in the 18th century, the relationship between the king and the people had become somewhat more complicated than this image suggests. But to see the people in the first place requires us to rethink the domain of ruling power in which they were situated. So it is the relationship between the assertions of sovereignty and the doings of the people in the Mughal Empire that will be the focus of my talk today. This will lead me to say some things about both notions of sovereignty and the workings of a popular politics in the city. To understand their relation, however, will require us to suspend some of the sharp distinctions that we have taken as given between the conceptual domains of religion and politics when we think about the pre-modern period. So my spatial focus today will largely be the city of Delhi, or rather the new capital of Shah Jahanabad, built in the mid-17th century, and its inhabitants. I question a fundamental belief about the Indian past, and in particular the later Mughal period. This is the deeply cherished idea that ordinary people were merely the passive objects of sovereign authority. This long unquestioned truth is encapsulated in the comment of Jadunath Sarkar, one of the founding figures of the Mughal Empire's modern history, that, quote, "the mass of the people remained human sheep," end quote, until the coming of British colonial rule.
There appears to have been some issue with the internet. Just let's wait for a few minutes.
Okay, sure.
Abhishek?
Yes.
Yeah, all right. Sorry, there's a bit of an internet thing.
Not at all. I mean, this is obviously, it's a miracle that this is possible in the first place. So,
yeah, please carry on.
Okay, so to be sure, our understanding of the Mughal Empire has advanced enormously in the century since the labors of Sarkar and others established the bedrock of contemporary scholarship. But despite these enormous advances, when it comes to the question of the lives and ambitions of ordinary people, and particularly urban masses, our vision has remained curiously occluded. So I'm going to begin my talk today with a reflection on imperial sovereignty in the later part of the 17th century, particularly as it manifested in the Mughal capital of Delhi. I will then jump to the year 1729 and to a discussion of a tumult which shook the city, which will give me the opportunity to make an argument about the relationship between sovereignty and popular politics in pre-modern South Asia. And I will conclude with a very brief reflection on the implications of my method for historians of the doubly hyphenated other, that is the pre-modern non-West. So we must begin with the acknowledgement that sovereignty, emerging as a much debated juridical and philosophical concept, contested from Jean Baudin to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, finds no direct co-eval or parallel
Vocês já ouviram falar no chupacabra?
May I just ask everyone to please mute themselves? Thank you. So from Jean Baudin to Jean-Jacques Rousseau finds no direct co-eval or parallel in Mughal intellectual culture, where no equivalent term merited similar theoretical discussion. Though the term has long been freely applied to Mughal rule, its unqualified and undefined use is misleading. To explain the changing dynamic between the king and the people in Mughal Delhi, and more broadly perhaps in Mughal history, we must understand the Mughal construction of political authority in its own terms. Notwithstanding the absence of the theorization of anything equaling sovereignty, as in the European tradition, the conception of an absolute ruling imperial power is readily discernible in the ethical treatises, that is the akhlaq literature, produced by courtly intellectuals. More broadly, this conception of power, which undergirded the Mughal dynasty's new and enormous claims to authority, was expressed at imperial centers across a range of textual genres, paintings, architectural features, practices, ceremonies, customs, and gestures. I describe such expressions collectively as a discourse of sovereignty. And I propose that this has somewhat greater analytical purchase than the reified category of sovereignty, which continues to be used as a synonym for kingship. So, with that distinction in mind, let us turn to a key concept in this complex of enunciations that comprises the discourse of sovereignty, namely the Perso-Arabic term dawlat. Without digressing into the many meanings of the word, for Mughal intellectuals, dawlat particularly connoted fortune, both in the sense of the divine endorsement to rule and in the possession of worldly wealth. In giving the king the supreme power to ensure the greatest virtue of justice, the possession of dawlat related the body of the king to the body politic. The shifting uses and conceptions of this ubiquitous ideal illustrate how successive articulations of royal power worked on its objects of governance, and offer insight into how the political transformations of the period were perceived, justified, and debated by observers. So it must be emphasized that dawlat was not an exact coeval of the classical notion of sovereignty, as it was elaborated amongst European philosophers of the state, and never in the historical period connoted anything resembling absolute authority over a definite territory. So I will, for the purposes of this talk, let alone the history of the term dawlat as it was used by Persian intellectuals in its early history. But the idea appears to have evolved in the aftermath of Amir Timur's conquests, now becoming infused with mystical overtones, which derive from Turco-Mongol ideas of divinely sanctioned rule. So a joke that is more than a joke, included in a work of the mid-18th century, recounts how Amir Timur, the ancestral founder of the Mughal dynasty, had a blind woman named Dawlat brought before him on his entry into his capital at Samarkand. On hearing her name, Timur wittily asked, "How can Dawlat be blind?" To this, the woman saucily retorted, "If Dawlat were not blind, how could she choose a lame ruler?" So, fortune was blind and could come to anyone, but the dawlat which accrued to Timur and his descendants was something special. This was a sentiment explicated in the reigns of the Mughal emperors Akbar and Jahangir, but most of all Shah Jahan. For Akbar's theorist Abul Fazl, dawlat acquired a subtle new tint. In his Akbarnama, the ruler remains as formerly endowed with the formulaic faith and fortune, Dino Dawlat, and the substance adheres to his lineage, Dudmane Dawlat, and the physical person, Hazrat Badawlat. The idea recurs in the discourse of the next emperor Jahangir, who, in renaming his rebel son Khurram without Dawlat, Bedawlat, proclaimed his inability to rule. The slight must have stung, for it is on Khurram's accession to the throne as Shah Jahan in 1628 that Dawlat finds its fullest expression. In the Foursquare Garden, a work of elegant prose by the king's secretary and ideologue Chandravan Raman, and recently studied by Rajiv Kindra, dawlat is now closely associated with the body of the ruler. Shah Jahan's dawlat is God-given and increases every day. He sits on the seat of dawlat. His residence is described as the hall of dawlat. His servants are the friends of dawlat. In one form or another, the word occurs 175 times in an almost equal number of pages. So the God-given fortune to rule, and the purpose of which is to enact justice in the world, is also reflected in the painting at Shah Jahan's court. Consider a classical example. In this famous painting of Shah Jahan, we see heavenly approbation. It is angels who bring, on God's behalf, the insignia of his approval, the parasol, the crown, and the sword. What is vitally important, however, is that it is in the king's haloed body that this approbation resides and which transmits it to the rest of the world. It literally puts the earth at his feet and allows him to create a reign so just that the great do not dominate the meek. And here you see the great and the weak sitting peaceably side by side. So it is by using the discourse of sovereignty as a frame that we can begin to understand the significance of Shah Jahan's most ambitious architectural and engineering project, the making of a new capital in his own name on the site of the historical capitals of Islamicate India, namely Delhi. So none of you need any introduction with where India is in the world or where Delhi is. Perhaps it might be helpful to see Shah Jahanabad as it appears in the new city. Here's a 19th century map of the city, which you will have seen. And so here you can see that this is Shah Jahan's palatial complex, the Red Fort, and it's a spectacular new theater. We should really think of it as a theater in which the king's body was made apparent not only to the nobility, but also to ordinary people. Again, elaborating on the enunciations of the sovereignty of Akbar and Jahangir, Shah Jahan directly and personally gave justice to his subjects, whether from windows of presentation, such as this one, where he was weekly available for petition, or whether in personally adjudicating disputes brought to his attention. So, as the complex of palaces, offices, and gardens behind the red sandstone walls of the fort marked the rule and the purpose of the dynasty, so the new city's world-revealing mosque, built on its highest feature, established Shah Jahanabad as a bastion of Islam. With peristyles on three sides, surrounding and imposing an immense central courtyard, the mosque's three gates not only facilitated access from all sides, but also marked an airy and self-confident openness to the city's population, whether of Muslims or potential converts. Chandarbhan, the Hindu courtier ideologue of Shah Jahan, reveled in the mosque's sense of height and purity of line. Heavenly spirits come to prostrate themselves there, he rhapsodized, while mortals do not even raise their heads from their prostrations, neatly expressing the imperial vision of a docile populace praying behind, or perhaps to, their godlike king. The same ambiguity of representation is to be seen in the elaborate engravings above the 11 arches leading to the prayer chamber. Given their use of the Naskh script, a casual visitor might easily mistake them for God's work of verses from the Quran. But a closer look reveals a single long inscription in Persian, albeit with Quranic quotations, styled by a certain Nur Allah Ahmad, which heaps flowery praise on the emperor as a, quote, manifestation of divine power, and crucially as, quote, the pulpits of the populated world continue to be decorated with the proclamation, the khutbah, of the eternal dawlat, which adorns this just and pious monarch, the benedictions of whose blessed and sanctified self have opened the doors of peace and tranquility on the face of time. So visitors were thus inexorably led to associate the intertwining of imperial dawlat, justice, and Islamic piety in the courtyard of the mosque. For just as Shah Jahan's palace audience halls evoke the mosque, where people prostrated before their god, so the mosque's architectural features and engravings evoke the looming fort to the east, indelibly linking king and justice to the temporal sovereignty of Islam in India. This was a relationship ritually reenacted on every Friday when the king's grand procession conveyed him to the mosque to hear the sermon, the khutbah, which publicly affirmed his role as the temporal ruler of the realm and to offer the congregatory noontime prayers with the community of Muslims. And you recall that this is also the image with which we began this talk, the image of Farooq's here going for precisely this event on Friday, in a few hours from now, in fact. The question of the Friday sermon will be important in our story of popular politics because in it was recited the divinely appointed role of the king and the obligations of the people, which were restricted to praying for the ruler's long life. The Friday sermon, therefore, should be seen as a literal and repeated performance idealized vision of the people at large. So, despite his troubled deception aspects of sovereignty enunciated by his predecessors, he visibly maintained the established commitments to personal justice and generosity. Yet, as both his contemporaries and later scholars have noted, sovereignty under Aurangzeb acquired an increasingly Islamic tint, with a concomitant lessening of the emphasis on the mystical aspects of kingship, and with an increasing focus on the Sharia and the community of Muslims. Though you can see, as in this very image, that the idea of divine illumination is not absent from Aurangzeb's reign, or at least in its earlier part. So, a community of Muslims, as it emerges in Aurangzeb's enunciation of sovereignty, was an idealized population that conformed to his idea of orthopraxy and was submissive to his rule. Of course, this was a courtly vision, and it should be contrasted with the actually existing small c
Brasil
communities of
Brasil,
Muslims,
Neymar, Ronaldinho.
disparate and heterogeneous, which had been scattered across the subcontinent for centuries before Mughal rule. As Samira Sheikh has persuasively argued, a key concern for Aurangzeb was to discipline variegated local communities of Muslims into conformance with his ideals, often with disastrous results. Now, Aurangzeb's primary means of disciplining the capital C, this large vision of the community of Muslims, into existence was by his unprecedented establishment of the supremacy of law over subjects, a process that Alam and Subramaniam have described as Qanunization. In practice, this was to be achieved by the bureaucratic systematization of the delivery of justice, which would now supersede the previous commitments to personal justice of his predecessors. He did not go so far as to cancel the practice of personal audiences for justice, as is sometimes claimed. But a raft of measures evidence his broader objective, including the appointment of public censors, muhtasibs, who were tasked with not only preventing vice, but more generally regulating markets and maintaining public spaces, the granting of greater powers to local judges, qazis, the imposition of the poll tax, jizya, the investment in creating a theological infrastructure with the construction and the endowment of seminaries, the appointment of scholars and the granting of stipends to students, and most notably, the commissioning of a vast legal digest entitled Alamgir's Judgments, the Fatwa Alamgiri, which remains a standard work on Hanafi jurisprudence to the present day. In all of these ways, Aurangzeb can be seen as making justice the core value of the discourse of imperial sovereignty, less dependent on his mystical nature and more on the law, and so broadening its sweep and intensifying its reach across the empire. In these respects, Aurangzeb was surely motivated by the ubiquitous report of the Prophet to the effect that the people follow the faith of the ruler. But there were unintended consequences to this desire for obedience and conformity, for, as we shall see, the increasing sophistication and reach of the legal regime under Aurangzeb also empowered new groups of people throughout the realm. Okay. So, the unintended consequence of Aurangzeb's disciplinary impetus is evident in many domains. But the key example I would like to discuss today are the so-called Khutbah riots of 1711, which would serve as a precursor to my discussion of the Shoemaker's Riot of 1729. So as I've suggested previously, the Khutbah, or the Friday sermon, was more than just a prayer. In the Mughal world, as indeed elsewhere, the performance of the Friday sermon and the circulation of coin were the two acts of expressing a claim to absolute authority, and the phrase sermon and coin, khutbah or sikka, are frequently used as a cliche to describe reigning power. So now, a mere 4 years after the death of Aurangzeb, Lahore and other cities of the empire were racked by unrest, provoked on the face of it by Aurangzeb's son and successor Bahadur Shah. Bahadur Shah is recalled by hostile chroniclers as having introduced change in the Friday sermon by adding the designation of the word heir or wasi to the description of Ali. This was seen by some as an intolerable deviation towards the Shi'i way and led to apparently widespread urban protests, particularly in the city of Lahore. The form these protests took is of the utmost importance because we learn from our chroniclers that the crowds assembled for Friday prayers began to violently prevent the recital of the new Friday sermon. In some instances, the sermonizer was attacked and killed. In one sense, there was a simple sectarian conflict at the center of this dispute. But there are two complicating factors. One, Bahadur Shah's sermon appears to not only merely add a single word to the text of the previous sermon, as chroniclers suggest, it rather represents a significant restatement of the qualities of the ruler. And this is evident in a comparison of the sermons of Aurangzeb and Bahadur Shah. Bahadur Shah's version is therefore a new enunciation in the discourse of imperial sovereignty. And seen from the immediate perspective of his court reports, rather than the later writings of chroniclers, the urban rebellion appears as a generalized refusal to accept an alteration of the sermon. So, to be clear, I am not denying that sectarian passion or theological difference did not animate the uprising. What I do claim, however, is that in trying to interpret this event in purely religious or political terms leaves us at a conceptual impasse. Why is this the case? Because, as we shall see, in the gesture of the interruption of the Friday sermon appears to have developed a routine and generalized quality that did not bear the marks of the sectarian issue, which originally enabled it. To make this point, in the second half of my talk, I want to discuss an event 18 years after the riot in Lahore. The scene is the Delhi of the Emperor Muhammad Shah. The year is 1729, and the time of the year has caused the conjunctions of the festivals of Holi and Shab-e-Barat. So, it is literally on the anniversary of the Shoemakers' riot that I have the chance to give this talk today. The massive disturbances which suddenly halt life in the city would be recounted by incredulous chroniclers as the Shoemakers' riot. Just want to confirm, everyone still with me?
Yes, Abhishek.
Yes.
Okay.
Very much.
Fantastic. Okay. So the Shoemakers' riot has received less, perhaps far less attention than it deserves. And again, I hope that you will forgive me for being schematic in my historiographical claims, but historians have tended to see this event as an instance of religious or sometimes economic conflict. And this is true of even very recent analyses of the Shoemakers' riot. What I would like to suggest is that in dropping our standard binary classifications of either religion or politics, we begin to see in events such as the Shoemakers' riot the practices of a popular politics which engage directly with the imperial discourse of sovereignty. So the events of the Shoemakers' riot began with an altercation between a group of shoemakers and a passing jeweler named Shubkaran in March 1729, at a time when the celebration of Shab-e-Barat coincided with the spring festival of Holi. A retainer of the jeweler who had been disarmed by the shoemakers returned with a party later that night to seek revenge on the shoemakers and killed one of their elders named Haji Hafiz. Joined by the city's Arabs and Abyssinians, the city's shoemakers gathered around their elder's corpse and demanded justice from the judge, the police chief, and the Emperor Muhammad Shah. When no justice was forthcoming, the shoemakers and their allies resolved to interrupt the recital of the Friday sermon in the congregational mosque. On Friday, the shoemakers and their allies came to the mosque's courtyard with weapons drawn. When the king's servants arrived to dissuade them from their belligerence, the enraged shoemakers hurled their shoes at the assembled nobility's heads. A general melee ensued in which the vizier's Mughal retainers ended up battling with the nobleman Roshan-ud-Daula's Afghan soldiers. By the end of the affair, the mosque's courtyard was strewn with broken bodies and the shoemakers had vanished. So how should we interpret this great tumult which shocked and astonished all observers? For William Irwin, the colonial administrator, who in conjunction with Sarkar was the first to fully describe the event of the early 20th century, the question of the people's motivations did not arise. The riot was significant only in its consequences for courtly politics and in the decline of the empire demonstrated by such unchecked unruliness. In such vein, later historians regarded it as a Hindu-Muslim riot, again symptomatic of a larger economic crisis, or perhaps as an instance of the increasingly strident assertion of religious communities, which unleashed long-standing intercommunal tensions that could no longer be contained by a collapsing empire. So what I want to highlight here is that in all such accounts, the question of the motivations of the shoemakers at the center of the story has remained irrelevant to the meaning of the event. Yet there are several troubling issues with interpreting the riot as a moment of Hindu-Muslim conflict. Most fundamentally, if the conflict lay between Hindus and Muslims, then why did the Muslim shoemakers and their allies disrupt their own Friday prayers? The answer to this question will take us back to the Friday sermon as the key enunciation of imperial sovereignty before the people. So what I want to suggest here is that what at first blush appears to us from our perspective in the 21st century as a, quote, religious dispute was in fact a political struggle that was waged in the language of Islam by the city's lowly inhabitants against the entire imperial order. Because they handled leather, the shoemakers of this city were regarded as the lowest of the low by the chroniclers who reported their actions. Here's a picture of an 18th century shoemaker, supposedly from, apparently from the National Museum in Delhi. So, quote, "Only the dog and the shoemaker know what's in the leathern sack," spitefully commented a courtly observer of the riot, expressing not just a common proverb indicating an obscure conflict, but also distinctly indic prejudice against the leather worker's caste defiled by his work as a tanner or his proximity to one. At the same time, the shoemakers were also noted to be devout and observant Muslims. Their elders are described as respectable and bearded. Some had memorized the Quran and were versed in jurisprudential affairs. And we remember, of course, the shoemaker who was killed was named Haji Hafiz. This might sound like a generic name, but there are good reasons to believe that he may have both memorized the Quran and also made the pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And I can talk about some of that evidence later. So the shoemakers began their agitation by approaching the city's judicial officials, who refused to take action because they were imagined, rightly or wrongly, to be in the pocket of the jeweler's powerful courtly protectors. This frustration with administrative corruption caused the shoemakers to, quote, "unfurl a chessboard of another kind," as a courtly chronicler put it. This was a strikingly profound observation. Unable to contest the game of urban politics by its established rules, the shoemakers changed the game itself. This alternate game depended on the mobilization of Islam as a language of politics. In it, the first move was to rally the community of Muslims around the body of the deceased shoemaker and make it a symbol of injustice through which the reigning order could be critiqued. As it became clear that the jeweler was beyond their reach, the shoemakers and their allies began by refusing to perform the requisite funeral rites for their martyred leader. So the significance of this gesture escaped no one. In a short essay on funerary rites, a Lahori theologian stressed that the importance of the timely and proper cleansing of the body made it fit to await resurrection. Though it claimed to have been written in the aftermath of a plague in which so many died that confusion about the rites of death arose, this treatise and others like it were probably produced to circulate among communities of the pious, such as the shoemakers of Delhi, whose Lahori origins, devoutness, and theological interests we have already noted. The Lahori theologian strictly forbade the clamorous proclamation of a death in public, for such was the way of, quote, infidels, not Muslims. So you can imagine genteel observers would have been horrified when they saw that the shoemakers and their allies gathered en masse to carry the martyr's corpse on a string bed to the jeweler's door, shouting, the faith, deen, deen. in conspicuously denying the mandated treatment to a Muslim corpse, the shoemakers turned it into a symbol of the injustice and oppression that they had suffered as a community. On Thursday, as the king returned from a garden outside the city, his procession was accosted by the shoemakers and their allies shouting, the faith, deen, deen, and justice, justice, insaf. To approach the king directly for justice was an established popular practice that drew on the imperial discourse of sovereignty, but the people's cries also signaled that they were invoking the privileges of the capital C community of Muslims. Playing his assigned part, Muhammad Shah ordered the vizier to dispatch a stern officer to find the malefactor and produce him in court, so that the matter might be settled according to the, quote, commandments of the resplendent law. Most observers thought no great efforts were made to arrest the jeweler because of his service as an appraiser in the harem. As the matter remained unresolved, the martyred Haji Hafiz's body continued to lie outside the jeweler's door, and we are told that tumultuous folk began to gather. So the Friday morning dawned with the shoemakers and mendicants inciting the rioters in the defense of Islam. Vast numbers of the city's Muslims responded. The shoemakers had been planning for the confrontation, for they arrived at the mosque with the iron heel pieces, the naliha, of their shoes. They also brought brickbats and stones in the hems of their long skirts, and the shoemakers carried the object of their trade and livelihood, which also marked them as demeaned and symbolized their oppression, namely their shoes. So these preparations to interrupt the prayer reveal the shoemakers' certainty in the fact of their injustice, the truth and the rectitude of their interpretation of Islamic law, and the belief that all others, even the king, were in the wrong. Now, the elite chroniclers perceived this sense of rectitude perfectly well. As one chronicler observed, the shoemakers marched to the mosque to defy the king and his nobility on the basis of the Quranic verse, hence, if anyone has been slain wrongly, we have empowered the defender of his rights. This sense of divine sanction united the shoemakers with their allies, the quote, Muslim riffraff disparaged by elite observers. One described the involvement of soldiers serving the artillery captains Rumi Khan and Sayyid Arab Ali Khan, whose names betoken their leadership of ethnic service groups. Others noted the role of the Ottoman, Rumi, Abyssinian, and Arab soldiers who arrived at the mosque with their flintlock muskets, pistols, and European guns loaded and primed. Where and how did these expatriates come to embrace the shoemakers' cause? Had they come to know each other through intermingling in the city's squares? Did they pray next to each other at the congregational mosque or attend the same gatherings of lowly preachers? Whatever the case, even sympathetic observers disapproved strongly of these refractory soldiers. One observed sarcastically that they imagined their support of the wronged shoemakers to be an article of faith and the courtyard of the mosque to be a battleground of holy war or jihad. Here, paradoxically or ironically, jihad against a Muslim ruler. Crowding around the pulpit and the alcove with matchlocks primed and arrows nocked, the shoemakers and their allies warned the preacher not to read the Friday sermon and loudly and impertinently accused the judge, the jurisprudent, and other officers of siding with infidels. Now, the significance of the potential interruption of the Friday sermon did not escape the court, which had been receiving reports of the multitude streaming into the mosque. The king was dissuaded from going to offer prayers with the congregation and to hear the Friday proclamation in his name, as was customary. Instead, he dispatched the vizier and the minister Roshan-ud-Dawla to negotiate with the protesters. And here you see both the vizier and Roshan-ud-Dawla. The agents of state sought to quell the disorder by recourse to both conciliation and coercion. The vizier and Roshan-ud-Dawla reached the mosque with their retinues, each entering it from a separate side. By the time the vizier arrived in the mosque's courtyard through the northern gate, the Chandni Chowk side, matters had already escalated. The infuriated crowds had turned upon the judge and his son, who had been beaten within an inch of their lives. The prayer leader, trapped near the pulpit with guns pointed at him, was being dared to recite the Friday sermon. The Wazir proceeded towards the pulpit and began to search for the prayer leader, the Pesh Namazi, and the sermon reader, who were lost in the crowds. So for one chronicler, this tense scene now became the scene of an artful negotiation between the rulers and the ruled. On approaching the crowds gathered around the pulpit, the Wazir attempted to assuage them by adopting their own language of Islam. He, quote, declared himself firmly in accord with the Muslims in the claim for vengeance for the martyred and oppressed Haji Hafiz against that tyrannical infidel. And chroniclers note that his, quote, smooth-tongued words doused the fire of tumult. For their part, some of the assembled expressed contrition and repentance for their disrespectful violence against the judge. In reality, adds a chronicler, the expression of support by such a high nobleman only increased the dissension. But equally, we can also see how the protesters pantomimed subservience to incorporate the Wazir and his soldiers into their own cause. Now, as the Wazir engaged in this last-minute act of conciliation, Roshan-ud-Dawla arrived with his own contingent of Afghan troops from the mosque's Badshahi gate, or the eastern gate. According to one chronicler, the Wazir had counseled Roshan-ud-Dawla that only humility and conciliation, that's a quote, would pacify the utterly enraged ruffians. But Roshan-ud-Dawla, confident in his Afghan soldiers and in his artillery, rejected this advice and responded roughly to the complainants. He began by closing the doors to the mosque, now that the agitators were hemmed in on all sides. Now, this is when the crowd's mood turned. This was the moment that they had feared and perhaps also longed for. From their perspective, the agents of state were combined against the people whom they had planned to crush all along. It is in response to this that the shoemakers began to fling their shoes at the nobleman believed to have given shelter to the jeweler. To be struck by a shoe was a pointed act of humiliation, which needs no explanation to my audience today. All the more so when the shoe was flung by the most contemptible at the most honorable. So when the retainers moved to dissuade the shoemakers from what one chronicler describes as a short-sighted course of action, one of the Abyssinian allies fired his musket in the direction of the two noblemen. Very quickly, the contingents descended into fighting on ethnic lines between Afghans and Mughals. And in the smoke and fury of the battle between the imperial contingents, the shoemakers vanished from the narratives of our chroniclers, who then turned to discuss the humiliation of the nobility and the larger consequences of the event for courtly politics. But let us stay with the shoemakers. It is for them that the riot would be named. That is, in their action, from the death of Haji Hafiz to the alliances they made with other groups in the city around his body, to their interruption of the sermon, which marks most vividly the people's use of Islam as a language of politics to challenge the imperial discourse of sovereignty. Through the remarkable capability of this language of popular politics, even the lowliest inhabitants of the city now directly contradicted the authority of the king and his nobility, which had been so carefully cultivated through the discourse of sovereignty. So, though I have not demonstrated it in depth here today, the relationship between sovereignty and popular politics was not always contestatory and oppositional. It was not, in other words, merely resistance to the exercise of ruling power. This is also evident from the workings of the riot in the mosque, which, as we recall, began with a challenging invocation of kingly power before turning against it. What of sovereignty? Formal sovereignty, it is true, did not fall to the people. Dawlat would be wrenched away repeatedly from the king's body in regicides over the course of the 18th century, but it would never fall so low as the shoemakers. But the dynamic of a conditional everyday acquiescence, supplemented by the ability to rise in concert when the entire imperial order was threatened, shows how even the humblest of urbanites had begun to exercise a measure of control over a political regime which had no place for their participation. So I think this is evident from one final image of Delhi from sometime in the 18th century. It takes us a minute to realize that this too is a painting of an imperial procession. Here is Muhammad Shah on his elephant who passes through the streets of the city. But the true subject of this courtly painting, as you can see, is not the king. It is rather the people of the bazaar who are engaged in their own toils and in their pleasures. In their indifference to the kingly procession, I think we see the recognition from the perspective of the elite viewer in the emergent ability of ordinary urbanites to as equally greet the king with a hand outstretched in supplication as with a fist raised in protest. This everyday political life of the city I have pleaded in this talk cannot come into view unless we rethink some of the categories of historical analysis on which we rely. In this vein, I have argued against the facile application of the concept of sovereignty outside the concept of its birth. At the same time, it should be clear that I do not advocate dispensing with the conceptual vocabulary of the contemporary practice of history. Epistemic balkanization, after all, is surely not the intended consequence of provincializing Europe. By repopulating the container of sovereignty and by treating it as a series of speech acts, it becomes possible to see the dynamic of a relationship in which we can also perceive the increasing assertiveness of ordinary people in a regime which had no place for them other as voiced spectators. But a further move is yet required. We cannot truly see the people until we query the distinctions, which are surely colonial in origin, that demarcate a proper realm of rational political action from an improper domain of piety, belief, and passion. So to make this case is by no means to instrumentalize faith in the service of politics, or to deny the motivating power of divine passion, or the sharpness of communitarian identities. It is rather only to point to the ability of ordinary people to develop an unexpected eloquence in the very language of faith in which their obedience was demanded. In Mughal Delhi, as surely elsewhere in the Mughal Empire, and perhaps in many other places in the pre-modern non-West, the practices and gestures of faith were profoundly productive of the solidarities and actions which allowed even the humblest of urban denizens to exert themselves against the seemingly timeless edifices of domination, in the shadows of which they were born, breathed, and died. In these ways, the relationship between sovereign power, gestures of faith, and the politics of the people was profoundly productive, and perhaps remains so even to this day. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhishek, for such a fascinating talk. You brought us, through your talk, the milieu of late Mughal Delhi came alive in all its contradictions in terms of the lowliest and the highest, or the noblest of the city at that point of time. So now the talk is open for questions, and I request people to type their questions in the chat box. Meanwhile, as people prepare, I have a very small. I'm going to abuse my position as moderator of this talk, and I have a very small question for you, actually, which is that as we go through your book, and it's titled "Seeing the People," but it's as much, as your talk, and I realize it's as much about people seeing the king as it is about people being seen. So how do we actually deal? And there is now some work which is coming out about this reversal of the gaze in so many ways when it comes to dealing with the Mughal Empire. Some of us have in fact also been talking about how the regions see the empire. You started with this idea of a particular kind of fixation that Mughal historians have had on the politics and the nobility and the kings and the center of the empire, but also how the peripheries are actually now looking at the empire. So how do we actually deal with this reversal? How do we actually engage with this idea of this reversal?
That's a great question, and it's one that I don't have a pat answer to, and it's one that I'll have to think about. But it seems to me that this really is the way forward for the study of the Mughal Empire. Because I think, and for pre-modern South Asia in general, because one thing that I've tried to suggest is that the ways in which we have read our sources have been formulaic and uncritical, right? Over a very long period of time. And so it seems to me that it's important for us to both, change the sources that we use, but also to read the sources that we use in different kinds of ways. Yeah. And doing that, I think, is important because it makes it possible to think about not only, perspectives that lie outside the perspective of the king or the imperial court, even in those sources, but also to think about what the empire itself means. So I think, Tanuja, to not directly answer your question, right. It seems to me that we are, poised at the verge of a serious and a historic reconceptualization of what the Mughal Empire itself was, right? And so, we, of course, all of us know the entire debate about the John F. Richards or Irfan Habib vision of a kind of centralized, strong polity, and it certainly does have those elements. And then there have been gestures that have been made to talking about a regional turn, and a lot of my colleagues and people in this room who I learned from have worked on regions as such, and new work has come out of that, including your own. But it seems to me that we still don't have a sense of how to take the regional and use it to actually refigure the empire in terms of the sources and the language that the empire itself gives us, right? So, should we think of the Mughal Empire as a Mughal Rajput Empire? This was one language that was used once upon a time. What would it look like to think about the fact that Kashmir has a very particular relationship to, the Mughal center, which is very different from the relationship that Awadh enjoys with the Mughal center, which is very different from the relationship that Malwa enjoys with the Mughal center, right? I'll reference the fact that our colleagues who are Ottomanists have done a very good job of sort of disaggregating how the empire works. This is not just because of the different trajectory of the Ottoman Empire, but also the fact that there are regional archives that are extant and present. And so I think, it is important, it is, centrally important that we think from the region about the center, and that should transform our understanding of the Mughal Empire. My perspective is not a regional one in this book. Right? My perspective, I do have a spatial perspective. Right. But I think that the general methods I'm advocating, should be uncontroversial, right? Or at the very least useful as we go about doing the big work of trying to see how we make sense of this really big polity in all of its sort of disarticulated and disaggregated richness across its enormous breadth over time. I don't know if that begins to address your question.
Yeah, it does. It does. We can come back to it in a moment. There are already questions which are popping up. So there's a question from Salil who's asking about the earlier historiography and particularly Jadunath Sarkar, who wrote extensively the late Mughal period and the fall of the Mughal Empire. I mean, does he mention this riot? And if he does, then what are the contours in which he is discussing this riot?
Yeah. So Jadunath Sarkar, William Irwin discusses the riot in his later Mughals, right? But it's pretty hard, in a sense, at a certain point, to tell apart Sarkar and Irvine's contribution. So I sort of see them as both working simultaneously here. Irvin's later Mughals discusses the riot as him essentially saying, this is a symbol of the decadence of the Mughal court, right? This is the inability of the Mughal court to manage affairs in the city. You see that there is a big riot. It takes place in the Jama Masjid. You have these uncontrolled, and obviously the implication is fanatics. And you have a corrupt imperial system, and you have this massive breakdown of imperial authority. And so these are the kind of piquant side notes that pepper the narrative for Irvine so he continues on the one hand with like a long political narrative of all of the complex machinations that are taking place in the Mughal Empire and at the Mughal center. And then there are these like little side notes that talk about, the terrible things that happen in the city. These kinds of accounts for Irvine, of course, reflect a kind of ideological predisposition of his own as a colonial administrator writing about India. But more than that, they simply represent what is in the sources. So he actually very, very closely for us just reproduces what the sources themselves tell us. In a sense, you could think of Irvine and Sarkar as the last of the Mughal historians who are writing Mughal chronicles, but in English. So they are the sort of essential first starting point, but I'll stop there.
Yeah. Does that answer your question, Salil? So now moving on.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So moving on, there's this question from Dr. Yogesh Snehi. Yogesh's question is that what if we read this riot from the lens of low caste shoemakers and upper caste Hindu-Muslim elites of Delhi? So caste and class questions about, not so much about.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question I've thought about extensively. Right. And I do read this precisely in these terms, but it's a little tricky, right? And it's a little tricky because no words for caste will ever appear in any of the Persian sources that describe this event, right? Formally speaking, the Muslims do not have caste, right? And you can make the case that these are people who have recently converted to Islam. There's pretty good evidence to suggest that these are groups of Punjabis who converted in Lahore and then moved to Delhi. So, in one formal sense, they are outside the system of caste as such. And you could even make the case that perhaps they convert to Islam precisely to escape from caste, right? And then you could even go so far as to make the case that their serious orthopraxy, their devoutness, their interest in jurisprudential affairs are all marks of people who are striving to achieve a kind of recognition in an Islamic society that actually has great scorn and contempt for recent converts, right? So anybody who is familiar with the Persian sources will see that there are always casual references that denigrate non-Musliman, right? Recently converted Muslims. Now, just because these people are not directly in the quote-unquote caste system, and we could have a longer conversation about what the quote-unquote caste system means or looks like in Delhi of the 18th century, doesn't mean that caste does not, interpellate their existence in every sense. And so I think in this particular case, throwing a shoe is a recognizable gesture across the entire Muslim world. But I think in places like India, this question of, the shoe, the leather shoe, with its close associations with the chamde ka kaam, has an unmistakable caste tinge to it. And I think what's really fascinating is that the shoemakers in this sense, by using their shoes, by throwing their shoes, are actually weaponizing the claims of their supposed inferiority against the people who make this inferiority or who, see them in this light. But this is getting a little hypothetical because, as I've said, terms for caste do not actually occur in the sources that describe this event. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, we can read it creatively in terms of caste, and I think we have to, but dealing with the fundamental caveat and caution that, it is not interpreted in that light directly by observers.
Okay. So there's Sushmita Banerjee who wants you to talk a little more about the last painting. When was it produced? Yeah. Where is it currently located? And if you can comment.
Yeah. This is a phenomenal painting. It's at the Raza Rampur Museum. It's a single folio sheet. I reproduce it in my book. It's described in, I think, by Mildred Archer, or Milo Beach, perhaps, in their catalog, and it's sort of described as a 19th century painting of Muhammad Shah's procession. But I, taking a look at this painting and having sought the opinion of some of my art history friends, feel relatively confident in thinking that this is a work of the 18th century. It has a very damaged inscription at the bottom right that I've been unable to decipher. So I can't really say much about the conditions of production or the person who painted it. But I think it's a really remarkable painting. And, it's something that should be compared, for instance, to the kind of paintings that Deepti Khera has studied so wonderfully in much of her recent work. It seems to be clearly hearkening to some of the kinds of Jain paintings of cities, the Vikrapti Patras that Deepti describes, with markets and lively markets.
Yeah. So Ranjita Datta wants to ask, and Ranjita's question is, I was wondering, with reference to Najaf Haidar's essay on shoemakers' riots, why would religion be downplayed? Can it not be a combination of all the factors: religion, challenge to sovereignty, and economy?
Yeah, sure. So I completely agree that such events are in one sense you could see such events as a combination of factors, right? But the problem is, if we simply say that they're a combination of factors, that like religion is an important factor, but also economy is an important factor, but also politics is an important factor. In a sense, what this does is it takes away our focus from the shoemakers themselves, right? And it always subsumes it to a larger narrative of either, the state of inter-religious relations in Mughal India, or the question of economic crisis or decline in late Mughal India, right? Or if you want to simply talk about sovereignty, then some larger discussion about like political vision. So my question is there some way that we can actually describe this event being sensitive to the motivations of the actors who actually lie at the heart of the event, and who it is important should be excised from the event, right? So, to be very, very clear, the Mughal chroniclers who write about this event don't write about it because they want to. They write about it against their will. They don't want to discuss it. This is a violent and disruptive act against their social order. And insofar as they discuss it in a sense begrudgingly. So the sort of violence of the Mughal, of the shoemakers, this coercive violence of the shoemakers actually forces elite chroniclers to write about it. I think it's important for us as historians to be sensitive to the actual act of the participants, right? And to try to see it from their perspective, which means, if not seeing it from the eyes of the shoemakers, at least trying to stand next to them. And I think that in, subsuming it into other narratives, we then start talking about other things. So why was it so important, for instance, for historians to say, well, this is not a religious riot. This is an economic riot, really. Well, that's important because, as we all know, in the formation of post-colonial secular politics, for people who work in the pre-modern period, it was important to say that, communal violence did not exist. And therefore to try to ascribe economic causes to all sorts of events that were seen as potentially looking like communal violence, right? So I'm trying to say that, we don't have to really necessarily think in those terms any longer. We don't necessarily have to sort of draw these particular divides. And in fact, we should think about the fact that ideas of religion and ideas of politics, as we inhabit them as Indians in our minds, have a distinctly colonial origin. Because in the 18th century, actors such as these did not draw these kinds of divisions in their minds. They did not draw some kind of line between, some realm of piety that is out there and then some realm of political action which is, valid and proper. And I think in my future work, I would like to make the case, and I think I would like to show, just how important colonialism is in drawing a kind of domain of proper political action, which actually then rents all the kinds of ways in which Indians conduct politics as being improper forms of politics, right? So this is the sort of colonial depoliticization of Indian society and its attempted reconstruction is, I think, a story that still needs to be told.
Yes, that's quite fascinating. In fact, the way in which in your work you actually sort of decenter the king and bring the people in when you're through your chapters, and thereby these various forms and means of being political actually become quite, and which is what I was also referring to when I asked you initially about the reversal of the gaze, where people are seeing what is happening. So when you're talking about the khutbah reading, or when you're talking about the mosque and people congregating, and you're talking about how, right down to 1857, the presence of the Jharoka and all, there you are talking how actually people are seeing the king. So the kingship is also something which is visible to the people, and that sort of centers itself in the multiple ways of being political in this time. And I think that's a very important insight and that's a very important decentering that's needed in our understanding of the Mughal Empire, I would say that. And so, I mean, there's, I think it sort of links up, because Ravi Prakash is asking about the chroniclers who are writing about the shoemakers' riots, and were they attached to the court, or has the chronicle writing become a public act, or like they're different, you talk about Mukhlis and various other people. So the public and the official sort of accounts that come up.
Yeah, so I discussed this in my book in a little bit, and I'm doing a little bit of work that should hopefully appear sometime in the next few years on this. But one of the cases that I want to make strongly is that the early 18th century is a really interesting time, because there's a kind of metastatization of historical writing and court chronicling, and so particularly around the events of the early 18th century and the sort of political crisis that occurs after the death of Aurangzeb leads to a kind of increasingly widespread writing of historical accounts by people who are no longer directly tied to the court. And so, to be very, very schematic, when we look at the histories that we have from the 17th century, these are people who are literally, sitting in the Diwan-e-Khas somewhere, and they are paid stipends by the king. But in the histories of the early 18th century, many of which are called Ibratnama, and so Ibrat is a very interesting idea, and it's something that I discuss in the book, and it's something that's worth having a longer conversation about, are now written by people who do not belong to that highest strata of society. And why these people are writing these histories is interesting too, right? Because we don't have a marketplace for books in the way that exists in societies that have widespread print. But there does seem to be a kind of sphere in which histories circulate in the present, not only for posterity, but also for contemporaries. And so in that sense, a lot of these chronicles are extremely interesting, because they tell us that there are people who belong to what you might think of as middling strata, who are now taking on themselves the really great authority of actually writing about politics, and also writing about their self-experience in political places. Mukhlis, of course, is somebody who's very interesting, and he's somebody that I am doing more work on. But he's very elite. He's an enormously important person. Many of the accounts of the political violence of the early 18th century come from people who are very obviously of humble means, who are humble soldiers, literate, well-educated provincials who come to the city to seek service, and then end up writing about things.
Yeah. To add to that, I'm just wondering how much of this writing is actually happening in, in Persian. How much of it is happening in Urdu? Is there any writing happening in, in various forms of Hindu, like in Braj, or so we know about Ardha Kathanak that gets written. But I'm just wondering whether there are these other perspectives on the riot or other things, like whether it is Nadir Shah's invasion, or whether it is various other events
Yeah.
that take place in, So Hindi.
Yeah. Absolutely. Sorry.
Yeah, please carry on. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, I was saying absolutely. But again, you would know more than I would about many of these kinds of sources. Obviously, my work has been more or less confined to Persian with a little bit of Urdu. Urdu doesn't really exist in the first half of the 18th century as a kind of literary language that people write in for this period. So so Urdu, sadly, I never found anything very much in Urdu. Though I should point out that one thing that I don't discuss here, but that I do discuss in my book, is the long Urdu poem on the shoemakers' riot, which is clearly written from the perspective of shoemakers themselves, and that's quite fascinating and important. So there is that. So there's clearly some Urdu circulating in the city in this period, and I'm sure that lots of people are speaking Hindi. Whether those written sources exist or don't exist is a larger question. We all know what the fate of the pre-colonial archive has been for places like Delhi. So it's pretty clear that lots of things are missing, lots of things are gone. Did they exist at some point? Yes. Do things still exist? Quite possibly. People will have to look in libraries.
And there is Riya Gupta who wants to who wants you to talk about some Persian sources that disregard recent converts that you were talking about and mention the.
So I see the question. I think that you should think of this as a kind of like sense. So I think what you're unlikely to find is any source that consistently talks about these kinds of things. But for instance, if you were to read Muhammad Afzal Sarkhush's Tazkira, where he sort of describes the poets of Delhi of the turn of the century. He has lots of sort of interesting comments about both his Hindu neighbors and people he doesn't like, and some of the people he doesn't like happen to be recent converts to Islam, and when they are, he'll make a point of like pointing it out. So it's kind of like general sentiment that is evident in all kinds of sources, but I can't think of any sustained sources that talk about this, in extenso, directly. I haven't looked.
Yeah. So if there are any more questions, we still have about 10 minutes to wrap up. And meanwhile, what sort of makes this whole talk very, very interesting is, again, the centering of the city of Delhi as this very complex space where there are, the questions of caste, class, and religion. All three of them have figured in the past of the city, particularly from the 17th century onwards, the period that you are looking at, and they continue to be at the center of it even today. And so we are sitting in a space where the question of protest is something that's been alive through the period of freedom struggle, and even in the post-colonial context also through the emergency, and consistently through now. So it's very interesting to be able to locate a very long history of these kinds of struggles and the politics of actually being able to look at the state from where we are located. So in that sense, I think it's fascinating, your talk as well as the book, where it sort of brings it all together in this very, very interesting and important moment in the history of this city. So it has been fantastic. It has been great to get you to talk to us, to our students, and to other fellow academics in the university and across the city. And we hope that there will be more occasions where we can have you over, and in a physical sense also, not just in an online sense. So
I would love that.
Yes. So thank you so much, Abhishek. This was fantastic. And Yogesh, in fact, has this suggestion, because Yogesh, again, his work is on Punjab, and he's been like looking at Sufic networks and so on. And he has a suggestion for you to visit Kabristan Qaum Punjabiyan next time that you come to Delhi. If
I would love to visit that with you. I hope. I don't know when international travel will be permitted, but I'll reach out and maybe we could take a walk through it together.
Yeah, you must, in fact, because we are located right in the middle of all that, right? We are located
Right.
where the Darashiko's library is on our campus. So, I mean, what is supposed to be Darashiko's library is on our campus, and we are right in the middle of Kashmiri Gate and right in the middle of a lot of history of the period that you're talking about. So,
Absolutely.
so it's an invitation to you next time that you're in Delhi, where you must visit us, and then we can actually look at a number of these sites that we are talking about. So thank you, Abhishek. Thank you very much for this very, very fascinating conversation. And from the Faculty of History and Ambedkar University, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be able to be in Delhi, albeit virtually. I miss my hometown, and I really wish I had the chance to have this conversation in person. But I'm so grateful to you for having invited me. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So, Nalini, the book is out, and there's also some papers that have been published, and I suppose I can send you the links. So, thank you.
Absolutely, it's all on my webpage. It's all on my webpage.
Right. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye. Is Tanuja here?